Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session today. So today we have a session planned with Miss Sakshi. A little information. She is a chemical engineer and an MBA. She has worked as a process engineer at the Guardian glass industry in the UK. She is a researcher at the Johnson& Johnson Diagnostics in the United Kingdom and has co-authored a research paper which was selected to be published by the International Journal of Logistics Management. Thank you for joining us for this session today, ma'am. You can begin.
Hi, Ria. Thank you so much for my introduction. And good evening to all my viewers. Thank you for joining in. The session today is about complex system and supply chains. And I'm really hoping everyone enjoys it and gains something from it. Now, I would divide this session into two parts. The first part, I would be defining what a supply chain is, what is a complex system, what are the sources of complexity that arise within the supply chain and organizations, followed by some examples of increased complexities within already complex supply chains due to the pandemic. And the second part of the session, I would be discussing about supply chain management. So what strategies and what measures should be taken by managers and organizations to control supply chain complexities or reduce them? Or what measures have already been taken during the pandemic by organizations or governments? So I hope you enjoyed the session, and we'll begin by defining what a supply chain exactly is. So supply chain is the entire chain or the system. It involves all the processes from the sourcing of raw material to the production of goods to the distribution, assembly and distribution, and ensuring that it reaches the end customer. So that is what this entire chain, this entire system is called the supply chain. Now, what is a complex business system or a complex supply chain? A complex supply chain is composed of different parts that are interacting with each other in a non-simple way, or let's say in a complex way, such that it is difficult to understand the behavior of the organization without systematic analysis or proper tools. So that's what a complex system is. Let me give you some examples to make you understand what a complex system is. We can compare a hospital to a school, and you could understand that a hospital is a more complex supply chain as compared to a school, because of the nature of the business hospitals are in, because of the products and the services that they deliver, because of the nature of the raw materials they source from, the various sources from where the raw materials are sourced, because of the logistics involved. So the nature of the hospital supply chain makes it quite complex as compared to schools, let's say. Another example of a very complex supply chain system I would like to give here is the medical consumables industry. So all the companies that manufacture, say, diagnostic kits, testing kits for testing diseases like hepatitis or HIV. So they make these testing kits. So this whole process of manufacturing diagnostic kits, or say manufacturing pharmaceuticals or vaccines, this process is quite complex because the raw materials, the nature of the raw materials is complex, and they're sourced from various suppliers from around the world. And obviously there are a lot of logistic issues, and there are a lot of government regulations and approvals that are needed for R&D. So all of these contribute to a lot of complexities within the medical consumables industry and supply chain. So this is what I mean by a complex system, a complex business system, or a complex supply chain. Moving on to where does this complexity come from in supply chains or organizations? I would say there are two factors that contribute to this. The first being the internal factors. So obviously, as the term suggests, these are internal factors come from within the organization. So say the organizational structure, the strategies that are put in place, the marketing strategies or the pricing strategies, the way managers behave, the transparency within the organization, the various processes for a manufacturing company or an organization. It could be a batch process or it could be a continuous process. The various processes that are involved in manufacturing, the R&D, the quality control, all of these are the internal factors that contribute to complexity within organizations. Now, I would like request Kishika to share the first framework to understand the sources of complexity within organizations. So any organization possesses a basic level of complexity that comes from within the organization, as I already discussed before, from the organizational structure, from the managers, from the way management works, from the processes. So that's the basic level of complexity. Now, every organization or supply chain uses reduction levers to reduce complexity within the organization. And thus, the level of complexity goes down from basic to the actual complexity. And then, of course, management levers are used to manage the complexity issues. And that brings it down to the perceived complexity. And various performance measures are used to bring that complexity further down, to simplify our supply chain, to reduce complexity, because obviously that would affect the cost, that would affect the efficiency of the organization or the supply chain. So, as I said before, the strategic objectives, the different variables, the resources available to the organization, the processes, all of that leads to basic complexity, which is reduced to the actual complexity and the perceived complexity, and further measures need to be taken by managers to reduce that. Thank you, Kishika, for sharing the screen. Now, it is very important to control, manage, or reduce complexities within organizations, and the main job is that of the managers, the top management. They need to do it in an appropriate way, and thus they need to use something which is called supply chain management, the SEM, and there are various measures that can be taken to do the same, but in the right way. Because if not, then managers themselves can become a source of complexity for organization. So they need to really conduct everything in an appropriate way to build resilient supply chains for effectiveness of the organization, because that does affect the entire supply chain. So that is what I wanted to discuss in terms of the sources of complexity, basically. Now, coming on to something really important here, often the word complicatedness is confused with the term complexity. They're not the same, because when we talk about supply chains, I would like to mention that complicatedness is something that contributes to complexity. Say, for instance, a static object, say a car or an electronic device or a computer system, a laptop, these are all complicated products. They're complicated because they're static objects and they're complicated. But the whole process of manufacturing a car or the whole process of manufacturing a laptop, that is termed as complex. So processes and systems, they are complex, whereas products are complicated. So there are two factors that lead to complexity within supply chains and organizations, one being complicatedness and the other being uncertainty. Now, complicatedness majorly arises from the internal factors, from the internal organizational factors, and uncertainty majorly comes from outside, that is the external factors. Now, I put together a framework, which was also part of my research paper for Johnson & Johnson Diagnostics, which is, again, a medical consumables company. And this framework discusses the two factors, uncertainty and complicatedness, and the sources that lead to this. So, Kishika, can you please, again, share the second framework for me, please? Thank you. So that's the framework that discusses the causes of complexity, i.e. the causes of complicatedness and uncertainty. And the first factor that I would like to mention here is new product development. And most of the manufacturing companies There's a lot of R&D involved. A lot of new products are on the verge of development. There's a lot of research that goes on. And I have to mention here that the more the number of products, the more is the complicatedness, because of course, the more is the number of sub-processes and the raw materials and the sources of raw materials. So more number of products, a product variety leads to greater complicatedness. And of course, new product development, because the structure of it, the new patterns that are being designed for it, the InDesign and co-design coordination of various R&D processes, all of that leads to complicatedness. And of course, what contributes to uncertainty here is the life cycle of the product, the external factors, i.e. the government regulations or the approvals that need to be taken to continue with the productions or to continue with the R&D. So these contribute to uncertainty with new product development and R&D. So this is one major reason, major factor that contributes to both complicatedness and uncertainty, leading to complexity. Followed by, of course, the sales processes and the production processes. So again, the product range and the variety that really, let me just scroll up, yeah. So, of course, the product range here is of great emphasis here, because complicatedness really focuses, it's quite product driven. So, again, the product range really affects the absence of suitable pricing mechanisms, or, problem with, absence of information visibility, that also causes complicatedness. And uncertainty here in sales processes comes from, forecasting issues, demand forecasting, delivery constraints, last minute cancellations, all that sort of stuff. Production processes, if you talk about, again, complicatedness arises from production capabilities, inventory issues, poor quality of the products, like quality problems, stock levels, inaccuracies, fraud or theft, or bending of the rules, and problems with production planning. And uncertainty, again, would arise from the product variety, because that is correlated to the raw material variety. So the more the number of products, the more the number of raw materials, and the more is the variety of raw materials. And of course, the number of sub-processes and the number of components involved, and the level of interaction between different components. And of course, just as I discussed before, managers play a very important role in contributing to the complicatedness and uncertainty. So managerial decision-making is important. The strategies and the objectives that are put in place, the manpower, information costs, scheduling and planning changes, volatility, price fluctuations, all of these contribute to complicatedness. Whereas the lack of information processing or transparency within the organization, or poorly designed systems, they lead to uncertainty. And one very important mention I would like to make here is about logistics, inbound and outbound logistics. And this is something that we'll be referring to in context of the pandemic, because logistics and complicatedness and uncertainty relating to the logistics and transport, this has really contributed to problems within supply chains during the pandemic. So when we talk about logistics, again, we talk about stock holding, costs, parallel interactions, outsourcing, and the geographical span of the suppliers and the customers. These cause complicatedness issues. And when we talk about uncertainty, operational problems like loading or unloading, again, we'll be emphasizing on this aspect in regard to the pandemic, and supplier backlog congestion along the logistics and supply chain. So these are the uncertainties that are caused, and these definitely lead to a lot of complexities, and have induced complexities within the already complex systems, especially during the coronavirus outbreak. And we'll be discussing about this very shortly. So this framework actually, of course, concludes that complexity has a high negative impact on the overall supply chain efficiency, on the cost, on businesses, on economies. And these various factors, these lead to complexities, and these need to be controlled or managed in the right way. And again, to summarize the framework, I would like to say that complicatedness is quite product driven because of the nature of the product. So say for a medical consumables industry, why I'm referring to this industry again and again is because it's quite relevant during the pandemic, because this is the industry, this is the supply chain that needs to be most efficient during this kind of a pandemic. So complicatedness is quite product driven because due to the nature and the variety of assays and the nature of the products involved, and each has different raw materials to it. And of course, the geography of the operations is also an issue here, because it's important to get the right kind of communication between suppliers and to make sure that the products are reaching the customers at the right time. And when we talk about uncertainty, the largest source of uncertainty is the raw material supplier and the nature of raw materials. So again, if I focus on the medical consumables industry or the pharma companies, they have a very vast supplier base, and a lot of suppliers. If the nature of the raw materials is biological, say if they're antibodies or antigens or proteins that are being sourced by the medical consumable company, then of course the nature of the raw materials is very complex, and the quality of the raw materials could pose issues, and the delays in getting the raw materials delivered could pose an issue. Then, of course, the regulations, the government regulations, and even the approvals that are needed for R&D, these are external factors that contribute to uncertainty. Demand forecasting and fluctuations. All of this leads to something which we term as the deterministic chaos in the language of supply chain management and supply chain. This is what we call it as the deterministic chaos. It causes a chaos in the supply chain, forecasting issues and supply problems. So all of this causes a lot of chaos. And this, of course, leads to complexity. It leads to uncertainty. Another thing I would like to bring to notice is the scrap which is produced because of R&D, because of the first factor I've mentioned here, the new product development. Because of the R&D, a lot of scrap is produced, a lot of waste is produced, because sometimes a lot of trials happen. You see new products are tested and they could be test failures, trial failures, and a lot of scrap is produced. So managing that scrap it becomes difficult, because of course, if the nature of the product is complex, the nature of the scrap would be complex, and troubleshooting the problem is pretty much time consuming, and the whole process needs to be repeated again, and this is pretty time consuming, and this leads to complexity. So these are the two factors contributing to complexities within organizations and supply chains, i.e. uncertainty and complicatedness. I hope we got a pretty much clear picture on this. Thank you, Kishika, for sharing the framework for me. Thank you very much. So I hope I could get across to you with enough clarity about the sources of complexity within organizations and supply chains. I would move on to giving examples from the pandemic, how supply chains have been really affected, and how complexities have increased within the supply chains. And I would draw examples from certain industries and supply chains. I'll try my best to explain those. Firstly, you see, over the past 2 decades, we are aware that China has become a very powering economy, and most of the manufacturing for global companies, for MNCs, it is carried out in China because of cost-effective manufacturing. So you see other economies, and a lot of companies, they rely on China for manufacturing, for packaging raw material, for a lot of things. Now, because of the coronavirus outbreak, a lot of companies, the processes have been slowed down. A lot of companies have closed down because the manufacturing was carried out in China. Now, because of the pandemic, say for instance, there's a factory in Wuhan that manufactured parts for an automotive company that delivered its product in the US, and the assembly was carried out in some other country. Now, if that company was not able to get its automotive parts on time from Wuhan, obviously just couldn't get it because the factories in Wuhan were shut, it definitely had to stop its own process, its own manufacturing, and the company had to probably close for a few months. So this definitely has had a very big impact on the entire supply chain, maybe for the automobile industry, or for the electronics industry, or for any supply chain for that matter that have relied heavily on China. So supply chains across the world have been affected majorly because of the pandemic. Already being complex in nature, they've had to face more problems because of uncertainties. And like what I mentioned before, the pandemic, this whole issue, is a very big external factor that has led to uncertainty and has led to complexity within organizations. And it has been very difficult to manage this. Now, if I were to draw examples, the first example I would put across here is the example of toilet paper roll shortages, especially in the Western world. Now, this is majorly due to the nature of the toilet paper industry and supply chain. Now, I hope this is of a bit of interest. It sounds interesting because it was for me when I was trying to work on this. There are two types of toilet paper varieties. One is of the residential type. The quality of the paper is obviously good, and the packaging is obviously better than that of industrial paper. So there are two types, the residential and the industrial types of toilet papers that are used. Now, the problem was that with the suppliers because they delayed in lowering the production of industrial toilet paper and increasing the production of residential toilet paper. And this obviously led to a problem among the customers, and it caused frustration among customers. And obviously there were thefts relating to the toilet paper. People were stealing toilet paper rolls. So it all depends on what product is being focused, and all depends on what is the productive focus of that company or the supply chain. Now, you see, the one very major problem during the pandemic is quarantining the people, and the big step which was taken by the governments in putting a ban on travel. So because of the ban on travel and because of the quarantining, it has greatly reduced demand globally. So this has been a major issue. And of course, another major issue when we talk about the toilet paper supply chain, the main problem was not of the production of the toilet paper. Even though the production continued down the supply chain or there were enough toilet paper rolls in the inventory, the problem here was to do with logistics and transport. That is exactly what I was trying to mention when I was talking about complicatedness coming from and uncertainty coming from the logistics of the transport part of it. So over here, the problem was how to ship it. How to get the toilet paper rolls or any other commodity to the end customer, how to ship that product, how to ensure that it is reaching the supermarket on time and it is reaching the customer. So the problem, the reason behind the shortage of the toilet paper and the problem with it was the logistics part of the supply chain. So because of the restrictions, the travel restrictions that were imposed by the governments, the trucks, they were not allowed to load the product or to load the rolls or to supply them timely to the supermarkets. The working hours were quite limited. So the loading and unloading issues, the logistics here posed a problem. So due to the curfews and due to all the transport restrictions that were imposed, the trucks, they were not allowed to load the goods outside the working hours. And so the products couldn't reach the supermarkets in time. I'm not just talking, well, I just gave an example of the toilet paper industry, but I'm talking about other commodities also to generalize this. Now, you see, warehouses were working over the capacity. So there was a lot of inventory issues also. But the main problem here to be emphasized is the logistics, the unloading and the loading problems. The fact that the product was not able to reach the supermarket on time, and so the buyers could not get hold of the product. So that was the major issue when we talk about the commodities of the toilet paper industry, for instance, here. Now, another example that I would like to take here is of the food supply chain or the food processing industry. Now, as we all know that the restaurants and the food businesses have been highly impacted during the pandemic. And obviously, the entire food supply chain has been impacted and a lot of changes have been made to it. Now, when we talk about that, I can take the example of the poultry supply chain. So, well, you see, when we talk about restaurants and bakeries, they make use of pre-cracked eggs to bake their cakes, to bake their goodies, for instance, whereas households, they use whole eggs. Now, the problem here was that the demand of the whole eggs was more than the demand of the pre-cracked eggs, obviously because of the closure of the restaurant business. And again, the problem here was that the two supply chains, the supply chain of the whole eggs and the supply chain of the pre-cracked eggs, they could not merge. And obviously, there were production issues. So because these two supply chains could not merge, again, there were problems in meeting the demand and obviously problems in supplying. So what I'm trying to bring to focus here is that maybe companies or supply chains or organizations, manufacturing companies or food companies, they could focus on maybe changing their product portfolio, maybe understanding what is of high demand, especially in a current situation like during a pandemic. Maybe a company that that supplies pre-cracked egg or the product, they could also supply the whole egg. So, I focus here on the companies reviewing their product portfolio and to bring the focus on customer. It should be customer driven. Their strategies should be customer driven, and they should consider a situation like the pandemic. They should consider natural calamities for the future. So that is what I would like to highlight over here. Now, when we talk about the food supply chain or the food processing industries, which have been really impacted during the pandemic, and in fact, you see the food processing units, the meat processing companies like Tyson, which was a US-based company, they had to shut their operations during the pandemic. And it was mentioned by Mr. John Tyson that the food processing supply chain is literally breaking during the pandemic, because I'm sure you must be aware of the fact that a large number of the employees at Tyson were impacted, and they were tested to be corona positive, and because of that, they had to shut down their operations, being in the food industry. And the problem here was that the organization had not taken enough measures for the safety of the employees, which obviously other food processing companies had to start taking to stop this problem. But many of the food processing plants, many of the food processing companies down the supply chain, they had to shut down their operations because of this issue, and also JBL Foods to be one of them. So the supply chain has literally been, I would say, they've been breaking, they've been scrambling down due to the pandemic. So again, the focus has to be for organizations. They have to focus on the processes. They have to focus on the health of their employees. That has to be of paramount importance. Strategies should be made in such a way that the focus is on the employees, their health as well, and also maybe in case of Tyson Foods, they could have moved their operations into manufacturing vegan meat. They were already into it, and they could have just focused on manufacturing vegan meat, because you see, this is an option that the meat processing units and companies of that sort could consider, because you see, the problem with the food processing units, especially the meat processing factories or companies, is that there's a lot of waste management issue, because during this time, during a pandemic or a calamity, what happens is Most of the raw materials are being wasted. They have to be thrown away. Even when we talk about the poultry supply chain, you see eggs, thousands of eggs are being thrown away. And even here, when we talk about the food processing supply chain, a lot of the products or the raw materials are being wasted. They're all being thrown away. So waste management is a problem because it's all the animals that are involved. They have to be depopulated. So there is a lot of issue down the food supply chain, a lot of management issue, a lot of waste management issue. And these are the sources of complexity and complicatedness that managers have to identify and have to work on solutions for it. A solution, for example, for Tyson was that they were already having a production facility for vegan meat. So they could have actually focused on the production of vegan meat and stopped the focus on this because there were a lot of waste management issues. And so that is pretty much it when I talk about the food supply chain during the pandemic. Now, coming back to the poultry supply chain and the supply of eggs, I would like to highlight here something that we learn, a theory that we learn in supply chain and supply chain management and supply chain complexities. There's a theory which is called the Bullwhip Effect. Now, this is a theory that has had applications that can be applied, especially during the pandemic. So, in the Bullwhip Effect, say if I'm talking about the egg industry, the poultry industry, what happens is that whenever there is there's a pandemic, people panic. People across the world panic and they run to the supermarkets because they want to overbuy. They overbuy commodities, they overbuy food. So say, for example, eggs, they just end up overbuying eggs and they end up overstocking eggs at their homes for a whole month or whatever. So the problem here is that in such a situation, people end up overbuying and then the shelves are just empty. So the signal that the supermarket gets is that, well, the shelves are empty, so we need to source more products quickly. And they initiate or they ask for more products, for more eggs, from the manufacturers. So they want to source more of the products. But of course, the products are being overstocked by the consumer. And because of that, the consumer would not just readily come now to buy the products because they already have the stock. So the problem here is about forecasting. So this obviously goes down the supply chain because this triggers down the supply chain because the manufacturer gets the signal that, oh, more products are needed quickly. And then obviously there are logistic issues. More products need to be transported quickly. More products are being stocked. More products, more eggs are coming to the supermarkets, but where are the buyers? They have overstocked the products at their homes. And so this leads to a lot of wastage again, because a lot of supermarkets have been throwing thousands of eggs because of this problem, because of this bullwhip effect. And this is not just with eggs, it's with other commodities, it's with meat, it's with vegetables. It's been happening with a lot of other products as well. So flexibility is very much required over here too. So this is about the bullwhip effect, which poses a lot of problem in terms of forecasting. And also a lot of coordination is needed between the end consumer or the supermarkets and the various parts of the supply chain. And this is something that management really needs to look into. Now, this is an example from the pandemic that I felt was quite relevant, and I felt that a lot of light could be, this could be highlighted over here in this context. I also want to talk about, again, bringing my focus to the diagnostic industry, the medical consumable industry, the people who manufacture vaccines. Why this is important here is because, you see, when tests are being done, the COVID tests are being done, proper testing kits are required, and swabs are required to conduct these tests. Now, there have been shortages, there have been problems in supplying these testing kits for the COVID testing kits or the swabs. So there have been supply issues, there have been shortages of these. Why this is very important here is because our frontline helpers, our health workers, our police, who are right there fighting for us during these times. Now, when they require these testing kits, when they require the COVID testing kits, they don't have it. There are availability issues. So this is because of, obviously, these are unpretended, unexpected sources of complexity, the external sources of complexity. But this is a major thing that the medical consumables industry is fighting to ensure that the end consumers, the frontline helpers, the healthcare workers, the hospitals, they get their testing kits at the right time without any delays. So delays are just not acceptable in this aspect here. So when we talk about the supply of these test kits, well, I am bringing focus, I'm mentioning about the pandemic, but even post the pandemic or before the pandemic, this industry, you see, getting the right supply of the testing kits, timely supply has been very important, even for diagnosing other diseases. So this industry, it has been focusing on the supply chain management, on simplifying the supply chain to a great extent. But now during the pandemic, they need to make a lot more efforts. Because when we talk about the manufacturing of the diagnostic kits or the testing kits, or maybe even when we talk about the laboratories which conduct these tests, they all are facing a lot of issues. You see, there are a lot of activities that are involved in this, as in, laboratory testing, the kits that are needed, sample collection, logistic problems, test execution, data management. So all of these constitute the supply chain of a medical diagnostic industry. Now, in order to increase the supply of the COVID testing kits or the swabs that are used for COVID testing, what companies have done, what organizations have done is the traditional manufacturers, they have increased their manufacturing capacity, and governments have given approval to new manufacturers, to private manufacturers to do so. So there are steps that are being taken by governments and organizations up in the supply chain that they have taken measures to encounter these problems, to manage these problems. And they have been involved in, say, scaling up production of the testing kits or the cartridges and the reagents that are involved. And they have also started to explore alternative testing procedures apart from just this. So there are alternative procedures that are researched upon and alternative manufacturers that are being looked on, who've been giving, and the approval process, because as I discussed before, in this industry, government regulations and approvals and restrictions, that play a very important role. So, newer manufacturing companies, they have started to get approvals quicker in order to be able to manufacture these so that the end customer is not affected, the patients who need these testing kits, it's of utmost priority so that they are not affected and we are able to save them. So during the pandemic, what my point of focus here is that supply chains, global supply chains are definitely complex in nature, but when we talk about the pharma supply chain or the medical industry supply chain, they pose more problems in terms of internal complicatedness already existing within the system and these external sources of uncertainty, these natural problems, calamities, this pandemic. So all of these have highly affected these systems, and it is of paramount importance that the top management identifies, they have been identifying these sources of complexity and problems. It's of paramount importance that they identify these to be able to manage these better, even for the future. These were the examples that I wanted to bring to highlight in regard to the pandemic and the complex business systems. Moving on to part B of the session now, which is what are the measures that should be taken to reduce or manage complicatedness and complexity issues within supply chain, and what are the measures that have already been taken by governments and companies during the pandemic? What are the lessons that they've learned, and how have they implemented newer practices into bringing about the much required change in the supply chain as well as the organizations? Now, first, let me focus on what steps our Indian government and other organizations, global organizations, have taken to control this issue. You see, I have to say that the competitiveness of a supply chain of a company, it is reflected by the way the supply chain is managed. It is important to simplify the supply chain to reduce your costs. It is important to reduce the number of sub-processes within an entire process. Because if you reduce the number of sub-processes, you're able to manage them better. You're able to provide better quality. So these are the kind of steps that organizations focus on considering, not just during the pandemic, even otherwise. And what we focus on, mention on here, is a term called supply chain management, SCM, and what all it includes. But first, I would say that for companies, especially during this pandemic, the focus should be on the product portfolio. So companies, organizations, they've started revising their product portfolios so that they know that what product is in major demand. What is the product that at the time of the pandemic is much required by the customers? So they need to probably revise the product portfolio, make it more customer driven. Their organizations need to focus on what is the demand of the customer, and they need to plan their product portfolio in that context. The focus should be on improving transparency, on bringing about transparency within the supply chain, within the different levels of the supply chain and the organization, because communication does pose an issue. There should be very good communication between various levels of the organization and the supply chain, and there should be transparency within supply chains for effective to improve the efficiency and for effective management. So this is what various supply chains have been focusing on now. What is also important is, I'm sure during the discussion, I have many times highlighted that the nature of the product and also the nature of the raw materials and the processes, that causes complicatedness and complexity. So what is important here is where is the raw material being sourced from? Now, because China is a country where lots of manufacturing has been happening and lots of packaging materials are being sourced from China, a lot of raw materials for many global companies come from China. So they have a vast supplier base. So the complexity comes from, the complicatedness comes from where you're sourcing your raw material. It comes from your supplier base. So what is important, what important step that our Indian government has taken is going from global to local. Localizing our operations. Rather than sourcing our raw materials or getting manufacturing, and not just for India, even for other countries it does apply, but India has really taken this seriously. They have taken this measure. They have made this. Very seriously. They've taken this effort of going from global to local. So rather than getting our raw materials or getting our production done in China or in some other country, the focus is let's do it here. Let's source our raw materials from India itself. Let's carry out our production, our manufacturing procedures here in this country itself. Why? Because this is going to simplify supply chains. This is going to reduce complexity. This is going to solve a lot of logistic problems. A lot of manufacturing issues would be sorted. Products that are manufactured in China. Now, if you're doing it in India, you can monitor them better. Not just would it simplify the supply chain or improve the efficiency of the supply chain, but you're also focusing on employing your own people. You are generating revenue within your own country. You're making your own country rich. Why to source from China? Why to get your raw materials from there? So this would definitely, moving from global to local, would definitely reduce a lot of complexity. It would solve a lot of problems. And it is definitely solving the purpose. So the steps that have already been taken by the government, that have already been taken by organization, apart from global versus local, is China versus other countries. If not local, like if I'm talking about other Western countries other than China, now they've started, because obviously closing down of operations within China have affected the entire supply chain operations. So they've started looking to other countries, Bangladesh, Bhutan, different countries for manufacturing. So the focus could be on China versus other countries. The focus, organizations could consider, rather than single sourcing, they could consider multiple sourcing. So when you have one single manufacturer, if you have one single supplier of raw material, they can give you more problems, of course. I mean, obviously they can, because you're relying on one specific supplier. But if you have multiple suppliers or alternative suppliers, then obviously it could solve a lot of problems. So these are the solutions that have been taken by the governments and by the organizations during the pandemic. Apart from which, obviously, improving the transparency or improving communication within supply chains, focusing on employees, their healthcare. Employees are a major part of your organization. So focusing on their healthcare is very important. Organizations have started to do that. Logistics, of course, which has posed in the past and has been posing now a lot of problems, as I've discussed in my examples. So focus has been on logistics management. You see, updated software and newer methods and automation techniques can be used to manage processes, manufacturing processes, and logistics. So what I can highlight on here is from some of the solutions and the steps that I have listed down. Planning needs to be done in an efficient way by managers, because managers are the main people who can actually solve the issues of complexity. So they need to plan effective ways. They need to be involved in strategic planning. The pricing mechanisms have to be right. The products have to be customer focused. Customer has to be the prime importance. Organizations need to focus. They need to retain the customers. They need to retain the suppliers. Now here, good relationship with your suppliers as well as your customers. Both need to be managed by an organization. So, for example, the company that I worked for and I researched for, that was Johnson & Johnson, obviously in the UK, my work that I did, but it's a global company again. So they focused on a method. They had a team for maintaining supplier relationships, which was called the Supplier Relationships Management Team. And they also had a team that focused on the customer, that would aim to retain customer. So having a team that focuses on your suppliers and managing suppliers and on having different options of suppliers, revising contracts with suppliers, and to maintain the relationships with their suppliers. If you have a team, or if you have a software that can manage that, is of utmost importance here. So managing your suppliers is very important, because your raw materials, in the process. They decide how quickly your entire process can run, and it decides how quickly your end product can be manufactured and delivered. So planning needs to be done in the right way. Alternative suppliers need to be determined at all times, not just during the pandemic, even post the pandemic. The organizations, they need to have a list of alternative suppliers. Also, the contracts with the suppliers, they need to be revised in terms of, delays in supply of raw materials or any cancellations. So revision of contracts, or this is of utmost importance here as well. Communication with the supplier need to be quite transparent, as you need to understand the issues. And organizations need to have robust planning. They need to have robust plans, so that even at short notice, they can manage suppliers. Even at short notice, they can have alternative suppliers who are supplying the raw materials or anything of that matter. So when we talk about controlling complexity, either you can reduce it or you can manage it. So there are two levers. And when we talk about at organizational level, these two levels are used. But of course, managers focus on managing complexity, because complexity is unintended and it's bound to happen in any organization or supply chain. So both the levers are used, but managers do try to use management levers more often. Now, the supply chain management, SCM, deals with what? What exactly does it deal with? The SCM deals in managing the entire supply chain, in managing the entire network. They focus on streamlining the entire supply chain. They focus on managing every part of the supply chain. So supply chain management is of paramount importance. Now, some potential options that are taken into consideration is, firstly, flexibility. Supply chain flexibility is required. Any organization also requires flexibility in its operations, in its meeting the demand. It needs to be flexible for the customer as well. Now, it is important here to reduce your lead and cycle times. We don't want to waste time. We want to reduce wastages. And also, again, processes have to be customer driven. Also, I would like to mention here something which is called TQM, that is Total Quality Management. Now, TQM focuses on continuous improvement across the organization and the supply chain. Again, it focuses on reducing lead times and cycle times. It focuses on process improvement. And TQM focuses on strategic planning and on streamlining your processes. It focuses on, to a great extent, focuses on employee involvement. So employees should be involved at various levels, at various stages in the decision-making processes, because you see, the marketing team needs to be aware of what is going on in the operations team, and the marketing team needs to be aware of, say for instance, the domestic toilet paper rolls are important more as compared to the industrial toilet paper rolls. So the marketing team could change their strategies, and they could market about the domestic toilet paper rolls, and the focus could be on that. So obviously, strategic planning, employee involvement, transparency, better communication, all of this is part of TQM, Total Quality Management. It focuses on the continuous improvement along the organization and the supply chain. Then I would come to something which is called supply chain road mapping. So that involves mapping the entire supply chain. Now, this involves a lot of metrics. It involves a lot of risk analysis, But this is very important. Road mapping or mapping the supply chain is very important to be able to manage risks within the supply chain correctly, to be able to manage risks effectively so as to reduce the impact of complexities during a pandemic or any other natural calamity. So the supply chain road mapping is important, and companies use a lot of techniques. It is quite technology oriented, and they use a lot of techniques to do that for road mapping. Networks and productions logistic control, that is also here of utmost importance, because you need to be able to have the correct way of controlling the logistics operations. You need to have the correct software to be able to control, to see if there are any logistic problems along the supply chain, and the logistics team should be able to control those. They need to have the right methodologies to put that in place. Creating pricing models, having the correct pricing models in place. Creating a streamlined, transparent, and a less complex product portfolio, as I mentioned before. This has also become very important for supply chains during these times. Again, as I said before, maintaining supplier relationships and customer relationships, as I discussed before. This is also something that is really highly considered by organizations. And management systems, having the right management systems in place. To find, managers, they should be able to find the root causes of complexity or complicatedness within the firm. Is it a strategy that is causing this? Maybe the marketing practice is going wrong. Maybe the pricing mechanism is wrong. So the manager should be able to identify what are the sources of complexity, what are the root causes of it. So management practices here are highlighted. They need to find out the main issue. They need to define the issue. They need to ensure that everyone along the organization understands these issues or these sources of complicatedness. And it is quite clear that, especially in the manufacturing processes, in the organizations that are involved in manufacturing, problems are more, complexity issues are more. And these solutions are quite considered they're more relevant for the manufacturing companies. Now, automation is also considered to be important, especially in a country like India. There are some companies where processes are not using the correct automation. So it's very important to use the correct automation techniques, to use the correct mechanisms. So this is majorly what I highlighted was the supply chain management ways that can be used to manage supply chains, to reduce complexities within organizations that are already being taken, or these are what should be used even for the future. Now, it is very important to be able to identify your suppliers very closely. Sometimes the problem lies in companies are not able to identify suppliers of suppliers. So it's important that companies are able to do that. They should be able to identify suppliers of suppliers and customers of customers. There needs to be a clarity down the supply chain. Each and every section of the chain needs to be considered by organizations and different levels of the organization. So it is very important to understand your suppliers and the customers both, to know that what you're producing, what you're delivering is appropriate, and whether your supply chain is simplified or not. Now, multiple sourcing is a strategy that is considered. You need to consider different sources, alternative suppliers. That is what I've mentioned before as well. So these are the different ways complexity can be managed. Supply chain systems, business systems can be simplified. They can be made more resilient. They can be made more efficient. And this is very much important for a company or an organization to supply with the competitors, because I would like to mention here that there are organizations that are doing really well during the COVID times, because they have been able to manage, even during COVID, they have been able to bring about real changes in their product portfolio. They've been able to focus well on the customers, and they've been really efficient in doing that. So getting the right technologies in place, getting the right management practices in place, these are the things that managers need to focus on. So as a conclusion, I would like to conclude that there are various sources of complexities. Every organization definitely would have a basic level of complexity. And all the other sources of complexity, they're unintended. Now, management levers are taken, reduction levers are taken to reduce or manage complexity. Definitely they are taken, but still complexities would exist within an organization. But what is important is to identify the sources of complexity by everyone in the organization or across the supply chain. And this is the reason a lot of research has been done into the sources of complexity. This is the reason a lot of research from my end has also been done in the past in regards to this. So it is very important to understand the internal and the external sources of complexity and complicatedness and uncertainty. We cannot confuse complicatedness with complexity, because products or static things are complicated. Systems and supply chains, businesses, they can be termed as complex. Now, internal sources, internal complicatedness, complicatedness is mostly internal. And the uncertainties that are coming from the external factors, they lead to complicatedness within the organization. So both the things, uncertainty and complicatedness, they are linked. This is what we could refer here to we could refer to the contingency theory here, that uncertainty is linked to complicatedness, because you see, the more is the uncertainty in the coming from outside, the more is the uncertainty from the environmental factors or from the government regulation. That means more efforts have to be made by the management. More managerial practices have to be put into place. Management has to put across more efforts into designing the right strategies to be able to control or to be able to react to the uncertainties. And this is where complicatedness would arise. So both of these uncertainties as well as complicatedness, they are linked. And both of these factors contribute towards complexity within organization and supply chain. So what I'm trying to bring to focus here is that it is important to be able to identify sources in order to be able to manage them or reduce them. And again, there are two levels here. Either you can reduce complexity or you can manage them. And supply chain management, SCM, that is the reason this is of relevance. This is why it is important, not just during the pandemic, even post-pandemic. And so during the course of the discussion, we highlighted the sources of complexity, we highlighted the two factors leading to complexity, and we highlighted with examples what has led to increased complexity within these already complex systems during the pandemic. Problems with the raw material because of the nature of the raw material, complex nature of the raw material, and the sources that they're coming from, whether it's coming from China, and because of the travel bans, because of the quarantining that has reduced the demand, and because of the travel ban, there have been logistic problems, there have been transport delays, because of which companies have not been able to fulfill, they've not been able to supply at the right times. This is the reason why supermarkets have been facing problems in forecasting as well. The bullwhip effect that we discussed about, that see overstocking, overbuying of the products or commodities by the customers, which led to forecasting issue by the supermarket and down the supply chain, which led to overproduction and henceforth waste management issues and a lot of waste being generated. So we discussed about all of these issues. We also discussed about issues that were coming from, of course, logistics that I've already mentioned, about issues coming from the travel and the transport, issues coming from having the right products, being focused on having the right product portfolio, issues coming due to a lack of transparency or communication within an organization or supply chain. So all of these are the issues that are being addressed and that need to be addressed to be able to reduce complexities and to be able to manage supply chains and to be able to simplify supply chains. And then towards the latter part of the discussion, we went on to identifying the various methods of SCM, supply chain management, one of them being TQM, total quality management. That means streamlining the entire supply chain, improving, making constant improvements at various levels of the supply chain, reducing lead times and cycle times, managing the processes, reducing the number of sub-processes, identifying what product is in actual demand, revising product portfolios, revising contracts with suppliers, maintaining good relationships with suppliers, identifying alternative suppliers, and also, what I also mentioned was something really important, was going from global to local, which has really helped. So going local has helped, simplifying supply chains has helped generating income within our country, focusing on other countries for manufacturing apart from China, which various nations have started to do. So these are the measures that have been taken apart from obviously getting the right management practices into place, the correct way of strategic planning, the correct pricing mechanisms that should be considered. So all of these, and obviously road mapping of the supply chain. So these are the measures that are taken by managements, that are taken by companies in the past, and now the newer measures that are taken by supply chains and governments. And these are the measures that can help in future, can help the organizations and supply chains and economies in future to fight this kind of a problem, to improve the efficiency, and to ensure that there's no falling of supply chains, or there's no breaking of supply chains, or scrambling of supply chains, that I would put it this way. So in order to be able to manage supply chains better, it is important to be able to identify the sources of complexity, and this is why it is important that managers identify that. So with this, I would like to bring this discussion to an end. Thank you for listening, and I really hope that all my viewers have had something to gain from this discussion today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ria. We are not audible. You're not audible. You're not audible to me?
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Right. As I was saying, with this, we come to the end of our session with Ms. Sakshi Khanna today. Thank you, ma'am, for sparing your precious time for this session. And I'm very sure that our viewers must have amassed quite a lot of information on the topic of complex systems and supply chain networks during COVID-19. So thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ria, for having me, and thank you everyone for watching and listening. Thank you.